She's going to talk to us tonight about Waterwise Gardening. That's an important thing, not just for conservation, but also if you're like me, looking at your water bill. So really happy to have you here. Thank you to Erika for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for that really nice introduction, Sue. Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for having me. I'm really looking forward to speaking. So I'll start to share my screen here. And so I actually want to start with a land acknowledgement before starting the formal presentation. So I'm located in Medford, Oregon, which is in the Rogue River Valley in Southern Oregon. And that is traditionally the land of the Takelma people. And Takelma means those along the river. And the Takelma were forcibly removed from their lands in the 1850s and relocated to the Central Oregon coast and also to the Willamette Valley. And so today, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians identify their members as living descendants of the Takelma. So we think we always want to give a land acknowledgement to thank people, right? So an overview of tonight's presentation, we'll of course go over what Waterwise Gardening is and why we want to do it. And I really want to give sort of a big picture or holistic look at Waterwise Gardening. So we'll go over various topics that are related to it. We'll also go through some planning and design. So, you know, some basic characteristics that you want to look at on your property and things to think about when you're thinking about how to incorporate a Waterwise design. And I also want to go over smart pesticide use because when I think about Waterwise gardening, you know, we think about conserving water quantity, so using less or using what we have efficiently. But I think it's really important to think about the water quality also and being good stewards of our local water sources. And so I want to touch on smart pesticide use. And so within extension, you know, we typically advocate for the least toxic option first. And so I'm neither going to endorse nor discourage the use of pesticides. I really just want to provide you with the best information that we have available related to Waterwise gardening. And then folks can make their own individual decisions on, you know, how they want to use those things in their property. We'll look at some photos for some design inspiration because I'm sure that that's something a lot of folks are looking forward to tonight. And then throughout the presentation and at the end, I'll provide some resources and links, especially to some other articles within OSU Extension, some from WSU Extension that have plant lists, how to get started with Waterwise gardening, information on soils and things like that. So my understanding is that we'll have that, we can have that emailed out after the presentation, but I'll also drop it in the chat box so that you can download it directly after the talk. So Waterwise gardening can mean a lot of things. Most people think Xeriscape when, you know, they first think of Waterwise gardening, and the word Xeros, the root of the word is Greek for dry. Something that, you know, we have to remember that xeriscaping doesn't necessarily mean zero-scaping. So it doesn't have to be this bland, blank landscape, you know, with just maybe some rocks out front. There's plenty of opportunity to have a really vibrant landscape while using water efficiently. Waterwise gardening also means smart irrigation. So some folks choose to have low or no irrigation properties, you know, but other folks, depending on your needs, want to have that irrigation. But there are a lot of really great systems these days that really maximize the water that you use. And we'll take a look at some of those later. Waterwise gardening is also paying attention to plant water requirements, you know, so not overwatering your plants, for example. Thinking about smart and appropriate pesticide use, if we do use those in our landscape, because as most of us probably know, you know, residue from that material can enter our local waterways from runoff or rains, leaching into the groundwater sources and things like that. So we want to be cognizant of that when we're choosing what products we use on our landscape. Waterwise gardening Also tends to be associated with gardening with natives because native plants tend to be really well adapted to local precipitation regimes. And so they require less, if not no, supplemental irrigation after initial establishment. And we also want to think about building healthy soil, right? Because a lot of the times if we're losing water on our property, it means that it's not infiltrating, not entering the ground where we want it to be. So we'll talk a little bit too about healthy soil. And of course, the big question is why conserve water? So we have some of these big picture topics, like we need water for agriculture, of course, for food. We need it for clean drinking water. Wildlife, needs healthy waterways. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we're really blessed with these beautiful lakes and rivers, coastline. And so it really behooves us to take care of those resources for all of the things that we use water for. And as Sue touched on in her introduction, a lot of people want to conserve water to save money, and if it's as simple as that, that's great. So, Waterwise gardening can really help you save money. And it can also help you save time because once a Waterwise landscape is established, it tends to require a lot less maintenance than more traditional landscapes. So as we're talking about water conservation, I want to touch a little bit on water quantity in the Pacific Northwest. So, of course, we live in a Mediterranean climate where we have these really wet winters and dry summers. And so we get most of our precipitation in the winter in the form of snow. But climate models are really predicting that we'll see a decrease both in snowpack over the winter and also some hotter and drier summers, which will put some stress on what water we have available. And so I wanted to show you all some of these tools that I really love for looking at annual precipitation and drought. So this first one is a map of the United States, and this is just average precipitation for regions in the country. And if you click on your state, Washington, you can zero in on your counties and see, how much average precipitation you get a year. So you folks get a bit more than we do. I'm down in Southern Oregon again, and we get about 20 to 25 inches on average here in Medford. So conserving water is pretty important for us. And I also like this drought indicator tool that's also from Oregon State University Extension. So it compares total precipitation to a long-term average. So you can see annually. Oh.
Erika, we're not seeing anything open up.
Oh, you're not? Oh my gosh. Okay, thanks for telling me that. Let's see here. Stop share. If I share my whole screen, can you all see that now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry. The first one was just basically a map of average precipitation across the country. It looks very similar to this. But again, this is, I can't really scroll here. This is showing average precipitation over a duration of time. So if you go down to the bottom here, you can choose to see precipitation over a year or between a couple of months, or you can look at long-term trends over a couple of years. So you can use this to kind of gauge, what has rainfall been like, what has precipitation been like in your region for a certain period of time. And then this last one I think is really practical, this drought monitor from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Here we go. And this really shows us sort of what state we are in regarding drought. So if we look at Southern Washington State here, you all look like you're not really having drought right now. If we come down here, we can see that they show us some different levels. And for myself down in Southern Oregon, we're having a little bit of a drought. It's been a really dry April for us, so I'm not surprised to see that. But so you can use these tools to, kind of keep tabs on what precipitation is looking like in your region. And then talking about water quality, you know, it's important to think about how pollutants can get into local waterways. And there are two main avenues for that. There are point sources of pollution and non-point sources of pollution. So a point source is pretty intuitive. You know, that's like a discrete identifiable location. So a storm drain, for example, would be a point source where pollutants could enter waterways, or unfortunately, we've all seen, you know, drains running out into rivers and things like that. But a non-point source is a larger area, and when a pollutant comes from a non-point source, it's really hard to trace it back to its exact point. So typically, some examples of non-point sources would be agricultural land use, forestry land use. You know, we always think about fertilizers running off from fields and into waterways, but gardens can actually also be non-point sources of pollution. And so, you know, hopefully this kind of puts it into context that the choices that you make at home with what products you choose to use on your landscape, you know, you can really be a good steward of your local waterways by being cognizant of what you use. And then this is just a little graphic of what happens with pesticides in the environment. And as far as fertilizers, fertilizers can also run off into streams or be leached into groundwater, especially nitrates. You know, but as far as pesticides, they can be volatilized. So either by wind or sun before they have a chance to, you know, do what they're supposed to do. They can also be leached into groundwater, run off into streams. And so we'll talk more about it later, but if you do choose to use these products on your landscape, it's really important to follow the directions exactly to minimize the risk of pesticides entering the environment in these ways. So planning your design, getting into the fun stuff. First, you want to start by having an overall picture of your property. So you could start by looking at slope and aspect. So looking to see, you know, do you have any steep hills? Do you have mostly flat spots on your property? Do you have any areas that don't drain very well? I have a spot like that in my backyard, for example, where during years of heavier rain, this little depression almost becomes like a pond, you know, so I know that I'm not going to want to plant anything in there that can't tolerate wet feet. So you want to take a look at things like that. You also want to look at, of course, existing vegetation or features, you know, to see what you have to work with. And looking at aspect and microclimates will help you to determine where you have sun and shade on your property, where it might get really hot. So for example, if you have a brick wall in your house that's south facing, you know, that might get really, really hot in the summer. So you'll want to be careful about planting close to your house. You know, also if you have boulders or larger trees in your property, you'll see that, you know, you might have some shade, you might have some protected areas, or if the sun is really hitting those rocks, those could become, you know, objects that radiate heat during the day. So you want to think about that when you're deciding where to put your plants. And then of course you want to look at things like what type of soil you have, what kinds of plants you have to work with. If you have lawn, if you know you want to keep your lawn, if you want to take some of it out, and then of course smart irrigation and mulch. So we'll take a look at those in more detail. And then with where to start, you know, sorry, I hit my table. You know, to be Waterwise, you don't have to do your entire property as Xeriscape, for example. You can if you want to. But even if you do just one bed, that's starting somewhere. Or if you just want to focus on getting your irrigation system dialed in, make sure that you don't have any leaks, you know, maybe upgrade to one of those smart systems that uses water really effectively because your goal is, you know, to cut your water bill and just not waste water. That's great. You know, you can really start anywhere. And even if it's just something small that's more manageable for you, that's fantastic. And then just thinking about design, you know, you can go formal, you can go informal or natural where, you know, things are just really, growing as they would, for example, if you wanted to install like a wildflower meadow, that would be sort of considered a natural design. And of course, you know, you can use whatever combination of those you want. So we'll start by looking at soil when thinking about what to put in our landscape, because the texture and type of soil that we have will determine what sort of watering regime you need and what kind of plants will be supported. And compaction is something to think about also. So you want to know if you have a clay-based soil or silt or sand. And you also want to think about if there's any compaction. So if there's been any recent construction around your property, you want to think about that. Or think about if there's any places in your yard that get high traffic, high foot traffic, or even if there are places where vehicles have been driven over, you know, numerous times. So think about if there's any compaction that you'll have to mitigate. And then as far as amendments for your soil, if we're gardening with natives, if we're using native plants, those tend to be very well adapted to native soils. And so they typically don't want a lot of amendment. A lot of natives do really well in mediocre or even poor soils. So that's another win for native plants. But if you did want to amend, there are, you know, there's a variety of things that you can use, and depending on what kind of soil you have. So for clay soil, a compost or coconut coir would be really great. And coconut coir is a more sustainable alternative to peat moss. And there's a great article at the bottom here of this slide. There's a link to it of, you know, exactly how coconut coir compares to peat moss, but it's just the fibers off of the coconut shell. And it's a lot more sustainable than peat moss. So you can use some of that. You can also use that coir in sandy or silty soils. And with sand, you can add aged manure or humus. And then with silt, you can also add aged manure or straw. So just depending on what kind of soil you have and what materials you have available, you can decide what sort of amendments you want. Because really what your goal is to have that right balance of nutrients to support your plants and also to encourage good infiltration. So you don't want that water draining too quickly out of your soil, but you also don't want it just sitting there. So in certain parts of my valley, our soil is just straight clay. So my backyard is straight clay. So that's been a little bit of a challenge to work with. But if you're not sure of what kind of soil you have, you can always get a soil test, you know, to look at pH and other nutrients that might be present. You can send the samples to a lab, and I've actually included at the end of this presentation again, some resources on how to take a soil sample at home. So this is a picture of a soil core, and your local extension office might have them available to borrow. And if not, the Soil and Water Conservation District might. Our offices usually make them available to folks. And if you don't have one of those, there are other ways to take a soil test. At the bottom of this slide, I'll have a link to a video that my colleague and I made when we gave a class on how to do a soil test for home landscapes. And you can also do a test at home. So there are two really popular tests. You can do a jar test or a ribbon test. And the jar test is pictured here. And that's when you sort of remove or scrape the top layer off of organic matter off of a portion of soil that you want to test. And so this is a 16-ounce jar, and I filled that up about halfway with a sample of soil and filled the rest with water, and you shake it around and then you let it sit for several hours. And you can see that there are these little bands, and these are the separate soil particles that are separating out. So you'll get clay on the very top because it's the lightest, followed by silt, and then finally by sand. And then there's also the ribbon test, where you can take a small handful of soil and moisten it and roll it into a ball. And then you can actually press it between your forefinger and thumb to kind of make a ribbon. And the idea is that the longer the ribbon is, the more clay you have in your soil. And again, there's more details about those in the publications that I'll make available to you. And then at the bottom here is our quick fun video for how to take a soil sample at home. So I encourage you to watch that later. So getting to plant selection, you can see in this picture that with a Waterwise garden, there's plenty of options for color and texture and growth habit. It can be, a really lush, full, vibrant garden. And again, we say choose native when possible because they tend to be really well adapted to local soils and to local precipitation regimes. And if if you're feeling fancy and you want something different than native, I would recommend getting something that is, at least adapted to a Mediterranean climate. So I'll just go ahead to the slide here. So this is a map where we can find all of the cool summer and warm summer Mediterranean climates on the globe. And so, if you want something different, maybe you want some sort of plant that's adapted to Mediterranean climate from Australia, or the Mediterranean region here. So those will most likely do well because they are adapted to the dry summer, wet winter climate that we have. Of course, natives serve pollinators and things like that. So there's a whole suite of advantages to that. But if you want to branch out, that's okay. You want to consider both site conditions and local ecology. Sometimes I like to think of Waterwise gardening as gardening ecologically. It's this really great opportunity can be a great opportunity to showcase all of the great natives that you have in your area. And it's kind of fun to go out and see, how do these plants associate together in the wild, and can I recreate that at my home? So there's a lot of opportunity for a really unique landscape here. And then, of course, we want to fertilize appropriately for some reasons that we've touched on already. First of all, you'll save money, if you're not fertilizing more than you need to. Second of all, what you're putting down will be taken up by the plants. If you're putting down too much, it could run off after a rain event or leach into the groundwater, or the plant could take up too much of it. For example, we know that, nitrogen, too much nitrogen can make plants really leggy. So it's just important to remember to fertilize appropriately. And then as far as zoning plants, you want to do something called hydrozoning, which is grouping plants with similar water needs. So, putting all of your plants together that have low water requirements and then putting those with higher requirements sort of separately, or at least in this way that you can manage the water efficiently. If you have one plant that doesn't require much and then another plant next to it that does, one or the other is going to suffer. So you want to think about that when planning where to put your plants. And then again, thinking about those site factors like heat radiating objects, sun versus shade, that right plant in right place kind of thing. And then this is just a graphic that you can go back to later, but it sort of describes, which hydrozone supports what type of plants. And you can see here right away that most natives require very low additional irrigation. They mostly just need it for establishment. And then once they're established, they'll need very little to no additional irrigation later. And so I want to touch on evapotranspiration briefly, because this is something that informs lawn watering schedules. So evapotranspiration is the process by which water leaves the soil and enters the atmosphere. So we have that through evaporation from soil to the atmosphere, and also by transpiration through plants. And 90% of the water that plants use is actually used in transpiration and leaves the plant. And so the plant transpires to cool itself, to transport sugars, plant chemicals, and minerals, and also to maintain its turgor pressure. And so you might notice, on a hot day that a plant is wilting, and that means that there is less water moving through it. And I've also read that some plants use wilting as a mechanism to protect themselves from too much sun exposure, basically. So if their leaves are drooping, they have less surface area that's directly exposed to sun rays. So that helps them deal with hot temperatures as well. So with proper irrigation schedules, you can check in with your local city or your soil and water conservation district, because they may have what are called lawn watering schedules or irrigation schedules. So they will look at current evapotranspiration rates and then determine how many inches of water your lawn needs a week. So that's a really useful thing to look into. I know that the Medford Water Commission does one. So we want to follow proper irrigation schedules, and we really want to make sure that the type of sprinkler that we have even is appropriate for the area. So we can see in this picture that this is not really an appropriate type of sprinkler because we're getting water all over the sidewalk. For something like that, this rotor head sprinkler might be more appropriate because you have a much higher chance of keeping all that water on your grass, And then for beds or for flower beds or vegetable beds, drip irrigation tends to be the most recommended because it's getting the water right exactly where it needs to be. And then I provided a link here to the Irrigation Association because they have all kinds of information on smart water application technologies. So those are irrigation systems that actually hook up to local weather data, local weather stations, and use local weather data. So they look at temperature, humidity, precipitation, wind, also evapotranspiration rates. And then that can help determine how much you need to water that day. So it's pretty cool. But I always hear that it's good to be smarter than your technology, right? So, just making sure that you're comfortable with that, but the benefits can be really great to using a system like that. Another big rule is to water deeply and infrequently. So it's actually better to water deeply a couple of times a week versus just for a couple minutes or really shallow every day. And this graphic on the right-hand side, and if you can't see this all the way, I'm sure you all probably know this by now, but you can move the faces around so that you can see what I'm talking about. But on the right-hand side here, this graphic really illustrates what happens first when you have uneven irrigation. So roots are going to go where the water is. And so you can see in this picture that on the left-hand side is where most of your root development is. And the same is true for how deep the water goes. So if you're only watering up into the top ½ inch of soil, for example, that's where your roots are going to stay and they're not going to be adapted for drought conditions. But if you're watering really deeply, I've heard up to 18 inches for certain plants, you're making sure that you're getting that deep soak and you're encouraging that deep root growth. And then here on the left-hand side is just a little illustration of what water infiltration in different soil types looks like. So for sand, we can see, we kind of know this intuitively that water moves really quickly through sand. So unless you've got something planted there that really prefers sandy soil, it could probably benefit from some amendment. And then likewise with clay, clay has very low infiltration rates. And once that water gets in, it tends to stay a little bit bound up in clay. And sometimes plants can even have trouble accessing that water. So the middle illustration here, B, is a better scenario for us home gardeners for what we want our water infiltration to look like in order to encourage the root growth that we're looking for. So we'll touch on turf grass a little bit. Most of us like having a little bit of lawn. There is something really nice about having some green grass to walk through in the summer, or if you have a dog or kids, it's great to have some lawn, and it definitely adds value to homes. That is definitely true. So it's perfectly okay to incorporate some lawn in your property if you want to. So I like this example here. This on the left is using lawn and sort of like the walkway portion of the back property to get to this little sitting spot, but you can see that it's still surrounded by some other Waterwise landscaping. So you can kind of start to think about like, well, where can I replace my lawn? Can I put a bed in here or something like that instead of having grass? And there are also alternatives to traditional grass mixes that I'll show you in the next slide. And And so if you do have lawn, paying attention to those lawn watering schedules is going to be really important. And just some other really easy tricks that you can do is to actually mow a little bit higher. So don't go, as low as you can. When you cut grass really low, you're stressing the plant, and it's really going to send a lot of energy up to, grow its leaf again and not spend so much time on its root. And you really want to allow the plant to develop that deep root zone. So by mowing it a little bit higher, you're allowing it to spend more energy on developing the root zone. And allowing your grass to grow a little bit higher also will suppress some weeds by outcompeting it. So you can see that really well in this picture here. And even on the right-hand side, it's got a little bit of a deeper, greener color. So don't worry about mowing it too short. Generally, the rule of thumb is don't mow off more than 1/3 of your length of grass. And so there are other alternatives to turf grass. So I put this picture here because this is a good example of a ground cover. This might be a creeping thyme or creeping oregano. So there are things totally different from lawn that you can put in. But a lot of companies now do different types of grasses or native seed mixes, and they even include a lot of clover. So that's actually something we're trying at home this year, is putting some white clover in the backyard instead of overseeding with grass, because that tends to require really low water after establishment. And it even adds some nitrogen to the soil because clover is a legume. So it's, sort of a win-win. And so I'll go ahead and show you PT Lawn Seeds site, and I'm neither endorsing them nor criticizing a business that I'm not sharing here. I just really like the pictures that this company has, and they're out of Portland. So this is an example of some drought tolerant mixes that they have. And you can see it still looks really green and lush and inviting. And even some of these mixes have, wildflowers and things like that, but they tend to require really, really low water input after establishment. So I always like to encourage people to look at those alternatives. And then it's something different and unique, about your property. And then with mulch, mulch is really, it's really great. It is kind of like the icing on the cake, if you want to think about it that way. It really helps with weed suppression. It really helps water to infiltrate around your plants when you water, and it helps to keep that moisture in also. And that can be really important during our hot, dry summers. Mulch also helps to keep soil in place. So, even once you've gotten your soil up to the texture that you're looking for and have added organic matter, adding mulch on top can really still help keep things in place. And then there are several types of mulch. There's organic and inorganic. So you have bark mulch, you can use leaf litter, you can use rocks. I've even heard you can use hazelnut hulls. And I've provided a publication from Colorado State University that has all kinds of suggestions on what kind of mulch you can use. And then we'll just go into smart and safe pesticide use really quick to sort of develop on what I'd introduced earlier. So when you're thinking about pest management on your property, you have this beautiful landscape that you spend a lot of time on. You want to make sure that it stays looking good. So we always like to say use the least toxic approach first. Whether it's tackling weeds or tackling a garden pest or things of that nature. So there are typically 4 categories that we look at. And the first is cultural control. So that means, basically not giving a pathogen or a pest an opportunity to establish on your property. So for example, with when we water, we typically like to recommend to water between midnight and 6 a.m. Because that is allowing enough time for water to infiltrate without evaporating from, the heat of the day, the sun. But we're also not extending the amount of time that a plant is wet. So you want to make sure that you don't water too early in the evening because the plant won't have enough time to dry off before night comes and before dew forms on the plant and things like that. And so if you're extending the amount of time that the plant is used to being wet, that could potentially be inviting fungal pathogens and things like that. So even if you're going to water a little bit later in the morning, typically after 10 a.m. Is not a great time. You want to do it before then, but you can pay attention to your property and see, how long does the dew stick around? And as long as that dew is sticking around, it's probably safe to water. Next would be, physical controls. So I had a call from a woman, a few weeks ago, and she was asking me what herbicides I would recommend for her garden boxes. And I asked her, well, how many garden boxes do you have? And, she just had about 3. And so in that case, I didn't recommend an herbicide. I recommended, that she hand pull them because for just something small scale like that, there are much fewer consequences to hand pulling than using a pesticide. And, in her case, it was possible for her to do that. She didn't have a limitation that prevented her from hand weeding. So, just try to think, if you don't already, well, what can I do instead of using a pesticide product? Then there's biological control. And the classic example of that is if you're having a really bad aphid problem, bring in some ladybugs. They're really great at taking care of aphids. It's a tried and true method, and you're saving yourself time and money with buying a pesticide. And then finally, in some cases, you are just going to want to use a chemical. So it's really important to remember, to read your label, which we'll talk about next, and just use what is best for your situation. And I also like to remind people that organic isn't always better, unfortunately. There are some situations where a synthetic pesticide is better than an organic option. So I just recommend, that you do your homework and reach out to your local extension office if you need recommendations. So we do always want to read the label and follow it exactly on a, bottle of pesticide. And it can be, kind of overwhelming looking at them sometimes, but if we just take a few minutes and read what's on there, we'll be able to see that we have these really important pieces of information included, like the application rate. So sometimes people think that it's better to apply more, and typically it's not. That product will just go to waste and probably end up in waterways, or end up doing some damage either to yourself or to your plant or your landscape. And so it's really important to always follow the application rate exactly. And if you use less, then it may not be effective, and it may encourage herbicide or pesticide resistance. So you just want to make sure that you do it exactly as it's labeled. The label will also specify what species the product targets. And so that's really important to read too, because if you're using a pesticide that doesn't work on aphids, you're just putting pesticides down for really no reason, and it won't work on those aphids. So just make sure that you're looking. There are products that are broad spectrum, so cover, for example, broadleaf plants for if you're thinking about an herbicide. And then there are some that are really species specific, like for some insects, for example. So just make sure that you've taken a look at that. And then environmental hazards are always listed on the back. So that's where you're going to find if it's really particularly not good for aquatic species, for example, or for pollinators, bees in particular. So make sure that you take a look at that before or while you're choosing a product. And then along with application rate, the use directions will be on there a lot of the times. We know not to apply something if it's going to rain because it's just going to wash right off and go into our waterways. Likewise, it's not good typically to apply pesticides if it's really windy or hot because it'll just volatilize and not do what it's supposed to do. It'll just go up into the environment. So just remember to always look at the label. And then I have some more information here from the National Pesticide Information Center, which is a partnership between Oregon State and the EPA. Okay, so some fun design inspiration, probably the part that most of us have been waiting for. So these top two are examples of retrofitting to Xeriscape. So you can just see that, there's a lot of different color, a lot of different texture going on here. And this is a low water use landscape, so it is possible. Rain gardens are something that people also think of when they think of Waterwise gardening. And so these, it's not really creating a wetland, it's creating a space where water is slowed down and allowed to infiltrate. So you can see in this picture here, there's a bit of a depression, and where the water enters, typically can come from a downspout or something like that. And the water will run off into this sort of low-lying area where there are plants that can tolerate more moisture. But of course, we want infiltration. We want water to go down into the soil. So again, we're not creating a wetland, just an area for water to infiltrate, to maybe do some groundwater recharge, or just, prevent loss of water into the street, for example. And then we have a great publication on that if you're interested in developing a rain garden on your property. And then these are just some examples of rain gardens. You can see that there's a slight depression here and a lot of plants here. So you can imagine that the water, has a chance to run down the hill, but then also is slowed down by these rocks and allowed to infiltrate into the ground before running off. And then here's another example of some stormwater mitigation. So this is actually a dry creek bed. And you can see again that there are all kinds of different ground covers with different colors and textures, and that these are just rocks here. So this is all encouraging infiltration of water. So you're decreasing, risk of flooding on your property, minor flooding like puddling and things like that, or major flooding, depending on what your situation is. But there are just so many interesting things that you can do with Waterwise gardening. And then I like this photo. This is an example of some porous pavers. So that's something else that you can do if you have walkways or anything like that. Instead of just using straight concrete, you can get some of these porous pavers, and that actually allows water to infiltrate also. So you're increasing the surface area or the opportunity for water to infiltrate on your property. And then this is just an example of folks who took out part of their lawn, and maybe the cat is sitting behind the new planting there, who knows. But you can see, that they kept part of their lawn, but they added some interest by adding this bed with some of these Xeriscape species. And it almost adds a little bit of a feel of privacy as well. So that can be a nice, something to do if you live sort of right on a busy street. And then this is a picture of a no supplemental irrigation landscape, which I love because you can see that it is lush and thriving and does not require extra irrigation. So that's quite inspiring. And then these are just some examples of pesticide-free landscapes. And something else to think about if you want to go pesticide-free is to celebrate biodiversity, because the more monoculture our properties are, the more susceptible they are to different pests or different diseases. But if you invite, all kinds of different species in, then you're also going to invite potentially different wildlife, a broader variety of pollinators and insects. So your landscape can really thrive if you celebrate biodiversity in that way. So just a few things for a take-home message. If you can, choose native plants, or at least ones that are Mediterranean adapted, because they'll likely automatically do better than an exotic because they'll be adapted to that dry summer and wet winter climate that we have. And so, you'll most likely spend less time maintaining them and less water on them. You want to avoid toxic and persistent chemicals when possible, again, to protect your local waterways. And You know, if you are using pesticides, make sure to read and follow the label exactly. And you can use plants to help manage your water on site. So like we saw with those rain gardens, you know, the more you have going on as far as plant diversity, you know, the more opportunity there is for that water infiltration on your property and the less supplemental irrigation you'll have to give. And of course, fertilize and irrigate wisely. And then these are some plant zoning resources, so you can find out what plant zone you're in. Most of you probably know what plant zone you're in. I'm guessing that the vast majority of you are gardeners. And then here are those Waterwise Gardening resources that I promised you. And so I'm going to put a PDF of this presentation and the resources in the chat box. And I think Erika and Janice said that it could be emailed out at the end as well. And then I'll actually have a short survey as well, a teaching evaluation survey that's really easy to do online that you'll have until Friday to do. And I'll put that in the chat box also when I'm able, and we'll email that out. So that's all that I have for you tonight.
There are a couple questions, Erica. I know you're in a different area than us, but there's a question about what is some of the best places to obtain native plants, or maybe tips on obtaining native plants?
Yeah, so native plants are really gaining a lot of traction these days. So you'll find a lot of native plants in local nurseries. You know, we have a couple down here, and you know, our population is quite a bit smaller than up in the Portland area, but we've got some nurseries that specialize in native plants. There may be organizations in your area that do native plant sales, and you can actually look to see if there's a Native Plant Society chapter in your area. I'm not sure if you have a Native Plant Society of Washington. I'm guessing that you probably do. So I'd say there are, you know, several avenues for finding those because they really are gaining a lot of traction.
Great, thank you. And then the next question is, can soapy water be used on aphids, and what is the best kind of soap?
I'm sorry, can soap be used on aphids?
Correct, soapy water.
Oh, soapy water. So like homemade soapy water. I don't typically recommend homemade pesticides to clients just because we really like to recommend research-based products. You know, probably the risk level in using homemade soapy water is pretty low, so you can probably try it. And there are, you know, it's going to be similar to an insecticidal soap. So, you know, while I can't really recommend a home remedy to clients, I would say that risk is pretty low, so you could probably try it and just see if you can find any anecdotal evidence, you know, to back it up.
Okay, someone has mentioned that they see gravel pathways, and they're inquiring as to whether there's a way to maintain these as far as weeds without requiring a lot of chemicals.
Yeah, so I guess we've got a bit of gravel in our backyard to extend our patio, and we're seeing weeds. So I'm kind of just doing a little bit every day that I'm out there. You know, putting down some really good weed fabric. Of course, that's not foolproof. I used to be a professional gardener and would see weeds coming through weed cloth all the time, but it does help. If you choose something like decomposed granite, you can pretty easily use a hula hoe to get some of your weeds up. So, you know, that's going to be a lot smaller than pea gravel or things like that, but probably easier to keep weed free because you can run that hula hoe over it.
And then someone is asking about if you could give examples about how some organic chemicals may not work. They just want to kind of learn more about that concept.
Oh, how some organic chemicals may not work. You know, that's a tricky question because I think that spans disciplines as well. You know, I was recently looking at alternative flea and tick medications for my dog because I just, you know, don't like feeding him a pesticide essentially. So, you know, there are some things that are made out of essential oils and claim to work, you know, but it hasn't worked for some people. And, so that's really tough. That's probably one of those things where you have to ask around and ask people if it works. There are situations, homemade remedies that you can do using cayenne pepper and things like that, that can work. But I don't have a really solid answer on how to address the issue of organic things not working as well sometimes.
And then a couple of folks have weighed in about where to get native plants. Someone has mentioned the Portland Audubon as a native plant sale, and then the Clark County Conservation District and Portland Nursery. So if folks want to send more questions in, I think Janice is going to come back on, and John may want to come back on. If we can see if a couple more questions come in. Looks like they're dwindling down. I would like
Go ahead, Erica. No, go ahead, Erica.
So I
sorry,
want
which Erica?
Erika Johnson.
So I wanted to just take the opportunity, if I could, and mention a couple of other workshops that are coming up. We have one called Know Before You Grow, which is about growing small fruit. So if you're thinking about growing small fruit, that's going to be on April 12th. And then on April 13th, we have a rain garden webinar. So if you are interested in learning how to build a rain garden. So please check out our website, which is Clark County Master Gardeners. We have our events listed there. Thank you.
And Erica, I am gonna just let people know that we have another, first of all, I want to thank Erika Szonntag for her great presentation and supporting the Master Gardener Foundation. We will send out an email with the links to all of the resources that Erika Szonntag has mentioned, as well. It will have a link to the survey that she's requested that we do for her, give her feedback on her presentation. And then I would like to let you guys know that on May 4th, that'll be our next meeting. And we have Linda Butler, who is currently the curator of the Rogerson Clematis collection in Oregon.